The morning of October the 24th, 1944, dawned with deceptive clarity over the Philippine Sea, carrying with it a silence that Lieutenant Takeo Yamashita found more unsettling than any storm. Standing in the cramped cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter, secured to the deck of the carrier Zuikaku, he watched the pre-dawn darkness surrender to grey light and felt the familiar weight of destiny pressing against his chest. The young pilot had no way of knowing that within 3 hours he would encounter a transformation in warfare so profound that it would render obsolete everything he had been taught about aerial combat. His training at Tsuchiura Naval Air Station had emphasized individual skill, the spiritually pure warrior engaging enemies in honorable single combat above the clouds. But this morning would introduce him to something his instructors had never imagined, an invisible enemy who saw everything, who directed dozens of aircraft with mechanical precision, who turned the sky itself into a trap from which there could be no escape. The mission briefing had been conducted in the Zuikaku's ready room 2 hours before dawn, with Air Group Commander Nakajima outlining what appeared to be a straightforward strike operation. American carrier forces had been detected approximately 120 miles to the northeast, steaming westward towards the Philippines. Intelligence suggested 3, possibly 4 carriers accompanied by their screening vessels. The Imperial Japanese Navy, desperate to halt the American advance toward the home islands, had committed nearly every available aircraft to this decisive engagement. Yamashita's squadron would fly as part of a strike force numbering 64 aircraft, consisting of 27 Zero fighters, providing escort for 18 Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers and 19 Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers. The plan called for a coordinated attack that would overwhelm the American combat air patrol through sheer numbers and determination. Commander Nakajima had spoken with confidence about Japanese fighting spirit triumphing over American material advantages, words that the assembled pilots received with solemn nods and fierce determination. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Yet, as Yamashita climbed into his Zero's cockpit and began his pre-flight checks, doubt gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. He had survived 19 months of combat, an eternity in the brutal mathematics of Pacific air warfare, and that survival had taught him to trust instincts over doctrine. Something about this mission felt wrong in ways he could not articulate. The intelligence seemed too precise, the American positions too conveniently located, as if the enemy wanted to be found. The Zero fighter that Yamashita flew represented both the peak of Japanese naval aviation design and increasingly its limitations. Introduced in 1940, the A6M had dominated the early war years through its exceptional maneuverability and range. Its 2,000-mile operational radius had allowed Japanese forces to strike targets that seemed impossibly distant, while its ability to outturn any opponent gave skilled pilots decisive advantages in dogfighting. But those advantages had been purchased through extreme weight reduction that left the Zero dangerously vulnerable to enemy fire. Lacking armor protection for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks that American aircraft carried as standard equipment. By late 1944, American pilots had learned to avoid turning engagements with Zeros. Instead, using the superior speed and diving characteristics of their Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters to execute hit-and-run attacks that maximize their advantages while minimizing Japanese strengths. Yamashita knew this tactical evolution intimately, had watched friends die because they clung to dogfighting tactics that no longer worked against an enemy who refused to fight on Japanese terms. The carrier deck came alive as dawn broke fully, with deck crews swarming over aircraft in the practiced choreography of launching operations. Yamashita felt the familiar flutter in his stomach as his Zero was positioned for takeoff, the ship turning into the wind to provide maximum lift for the heavily loaded fighters. Around him, 59 other aircraft prepared for launch, their engines creating a thunder that seemed to shake the very ocean beneath the carrier's hull. At 0615 hours, Commander Nakajima's Zero roared down the flight deck and lifted into the morning sky, followed at precise intervals by the rest of the strike force. Yamashita's turn came at 0623. He advanced his throttle to full power, felt the Sake engine's 14 cylinders respond with a surge that pressed him back into his seat and released his brakes. The Zero accelerated down the deck, the island's superstructure blurring past his peripheral vision, and then the blessed sensation of flight as his aircraft lifted free and climbed into the humid air. The formation assembled with practiced efficiency, despite the pre-dawn gloom, each pilot finding his assigned position through careful attention to navigation lights and hand signals from flight leaders. Yamashita flew as wingman to Lieutenant Commander Saito, a veteran of China and the early Pacific campaigns, whose skill and experience commanded deep respect throughout the air group. As they climbed to their cruise altitude of 15,000 feet and turned northeast toward the reported enemy position, Yamashita could see the entire strike force spread across the sky, an armada of aircraft representing one of the Imperial Navy's last concentrated aerial efforts. The flight toward contact stretched across 90 minutes of tense anticipation. Yamashita scanned the horizon continuously, searching for the telltale dark spots that would indicate enemy fighters, while simultaneously monitoring his instruments and maintaining formation position. The sky remained empty of threats, showing only the endless blue expanse of the Pacific and scattered cumulus clouds that cast moving shadows on the ocean below. It seemed impossible that such a beautiful morning could harbor violence, yet Yamashita's combat experience had taught him that war recognized no distinction between beautiful days and ugly ones. At 0745, with the strike force approximately 40 miles from the estimated enemy position, Commander Nakajima's voice crackled through Yamashita's radio headset. "All aircraft, maintain alert. Enemy fighters, expected shortly." The warning sent adrenaline surging through Yamashita's bloodstream as he tightened his grip on the control stick and increased his visual scanning rate. Somewhere ahead, American carriers had launched their defensive fighters, and those Hellcats would be climbing to intercept altitude even now. What Yamashita could not know, what no Japanese pilot in that strike force understood, was that their approach had been tracked continuously since launch. Aboard the American carrier USS Lexington, radar operators had detected the Japanese formation while it was still 100 miles distant, painting as a dense cluster of returns on their circular green screens. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Edgar, serving as fighter director in the Lexington's Combat Information Center, had been directing the positioning of American fighters for the past hour, stacking them in defensive layers that the Japanese would have to penetrate. According to historical records preserved in the Naval Historical Center archives and detailed in comprehensive works like Barrett Tillman's examination of Hellcat operations during the Pacific War, the Americans had revolutionized carrier defense through the integration of radar detection and centralized fighter control. This system allowed a single officer to coordinate dozens of aircraft with precision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier, turning what had been chaotic individual actions into orchestrated defense that could overwhelm even numerically superior attackers. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came at 0752, when Yamashita spotted sunlight glinting off metal at his 2 o'clock position, approximately 3,000 feet above the Japanese formation. "Fighters, high and right." The call went out simultaneously from multiple Zero pilots as they recognized the distinctive profile of Grumman Hellcats diving toward them. But the speed and coordination of the American attack suggested something beyond the random patrol encounters that Yamashita had experienced in previous engagements. The Hellcats came down in perfect spacing, each fighter apparently knowing exactly where to position for maximum effect. They struck the Japanese formation like precisely thrown stones hitting water, their 6 50 caliber machine guns hammering into Zeros and bombers with devastating accuracy. Yamashita snap-rolled right, following Lieutenant Commander Saito as they maneuvered to engage the attackers. But before they could bring their guns to bear, the American fighters had already climbed away, using their superior speed to disengage before the Zeros could respond. "Reform formation!" Commander Nakajima's voice cut through the radio chatter, attempting to restore order to a strike force that had been scattered by the initial attack. Yamashita pulled back into position, noting with growing concern that two of the torpedo bombers were gone, trailing smoke as they fell toward the ocean far below. The Americans had executed their attack with surgical precision, targeting the most vulnerable aircraft and withdrawing before sustaining any losses themselves. The strike force had barely re-established cohesion when the second wave of Hellcats appeared, this time attacking from the left and slightly below. Again, the coordination seemed unnatural, as if the American pilots knew exactly where to strike for maximum disruption. Yamashita found himself in a brief turning engagement with a Hellcat whose pilot showed competent but not exceptional skill. Yet, before he could gain firing position, two more Hellcats appeared from nowhere, forcing him into defensive maneuvers that consumed precious altitude and fuel. Lieutenant Commander Saito's voice came through the radio with unusual strain. "They are everywhere. How do they position so perfectly?" It was a question that reflected the growing confusion throughout the Japanese formation. American fighters seemed to appear wherever the strike force turned, attacking in coordinated pairs and divisions that suggested detailed knowledge of Japanese movements and intentions. At 0810, approximately 65 miles from the American carriers, the Japanese formation encountered what appeared to be a solid wall of Hellcats. Yamashita's breath caught in his throat as he counted the enemy fighters arrayed before them. 10, 15, 20 aircraft, all positioned at optimal altitude and spacing to intercept the strike force. And behind this first line, he could see additional Hellcats stacked at different altitudes, creating a defensive depth that would require the Japanese to fight through multiple layers of opposition. The mathematics of the situation became brutally clear in that moment. The Japanese strike force had started with 27 Zeros, but combat attrition had already reduced that number to perhaps 22 or 23 serviceable fighters. They faced what appeared to be at least 40 American fighters, possibly more, all of which enjoyed superior speed, firepower, and climbing ability. The bombers they were supposed to protect remained vulnerable, struggling to maintain formation, while surrounded by threats from every direction. Commander Nakajima ordered the torpedo bombers to descend and approach at wave-top altitude, the classic tactic for splitting enemy defenses between high and low threats. The dive bombers would continue at medium altitude, while the Zeros attempted to engage and tie down the American fighters. It was sound doctrine, proven in earlier battles, but Yamashita sensed that doctrine meant little against an enemy who seemed to anticipate every move before it was made. The battle that followed over the next 25 minutes would later be analyzed by military historians as a textbook example of radar-directed air defense overwhelming a conventionally coordinated strike force. For Yamashita, experiencing it from inside his Zero's cramped cockpit, it felt like fighting a supernatural opponent who could see through clouds and distance, who knew where he would be before he arrived there. Every time the Japanese formation attempted to consolidate, American fighters appeared to disrupt the effort. Every gap in the defensive screen was immediately filled. Every promising approach vector was blocked by Hellcats that seemed to materialize from empty sky. Yamashita found himself in constant maneuvering combat, never achieving firing position, always reacting to threats from unexpected angles. His ammunition counter dropped steadily as he fired desperate bursts at Hellcats that flashed past too quickly for accurate shooting. At 0835, the grim reality became inescapable. The strike force had been shredded. Of the 18 torpedo bombers that had launched from Zuikaku, only 7 remained airborne, and most of those showed battle damage. The dive bombers had fared slightly better, with 11 still flying, but they too had suffered grievous losses. The Zero escorts had been reduced to perhaps 15 aircraft, many of them low on fuel and ammunition, all of them showing the strain of continuous combat against superior numbers. Lieutenant Commander Saito's Zero had taken hits to its engine, trailing white smoke that indicated coolant loss and imminent mechanical failure. Yamashita flew close formation on his leader, ready to report Saito's position if he was forced to ditch in the ocean. But knowing that rescue from these waters, so far from friendly forces, was essentially impossible. The older pilot's voice came through the radio, calm, despite his situation. "Yamashita, you must observe and report what we face here. This is not normal combat. There is coordination beyond anything we have encountered. "Hi, Commander, I will report." Yamashita's response carried the formal acknowledgement that he might be inheriting Saito's final wish, the obligation to ensure that their deaths carried meaning through intelligence that might help future operations. Even as he spoke, another part of his mind was counting, calculating, and trying to understand the tactical situation that had destroyed his strike force. The numbers defied belief. Yamashita had personally observed at least 30 different Hellcats during the engagement, probably more, as it was difficult to distinguish individual aircraft in the chaos of combat. But what struck him more than the numbers was the coordination. American fighters appeared to be operating as a unified force, responding to threats and opportunities with a synchronization that suggested centralized control rather than individual initiative. Several times during the battle, Yamashita had noticed American fighters breaking off engagements suddenly and repositioning to other areas, as if responding to orders that prioritized different threats. This behavior was inconsistent with typical fighter pilot instincts, which favored pursuing advantageous combats to conclusion. It suggested that someone somewhere was watching the entire battle and directing American fighters based on a comprehensive understanding of the tactical situation. At 0842, Commander Nakajima made the decision that every combat leader dreads, but sometimes cannot avoid. All aircraft, abort attack, and return to base. Repeat, abort attack, and return to base. The admission of failure cut through the radio chatter like a blade, silencing all other transmissions for a moment as pilots absorbed the reality that they had been defeated without even reaching their targets. The remnants of the strike force turned west, away from the American carriers that remained visible only as dark shapes on the horizon, and began the long flight back toward their launching point. Yamashita maintained position on Lieutenant Commander Saito's damaged Zero, watching the smoke trail grow thicker as his leader's engine deteriorated. Around them, the surviving Japanese aircraft formed a ragged defensive formation, still alert for American fighters that might pursue and finish what they had started. The pursuit came, but not in the overwhelming numbers that Yamashita expected. A few Hellcats harried the retreating Japanese formation, making occasional firing passes, but not pressing attacks with determination. It was as if the Americans knew they had already won decisively and saw no need to risk losses in pursuit. This restraint, this calculated efficiency, seemed more unsettling to Yamashita than aggressive pursuit would have been. It spoke of an enemy that measured costs and benefits with cold precision, that understood how to achieve objectives without unnecessary expenditure of resources. Lieutenant Commander Saito's engine finally seized at 0915, the white smoke trail suddenly becoming black as lubricating oil ignited. The older pilot's voice came through the radio one final time. "Yamashita, remember what you have seen. Tell them about the coordination. The Americans have developed something new, something we do not understand. Our tactics must change, or more will die, as I am about to die." Before Yamashita could respond, Saito rolled his Zero inverted and dove toward the ocean, choosing a quick end over the prolonged agony of ditching and slow death from exposure or drowning. Yamashita watched his leader's aircraft strike the water in a white fountain of spray, then disappear beneath the waves as if it had never existed. Grief would come later, he knew, but for now he forced himself to maintain focus on survival and the responsibility that Saito had placed upon him. The mission had failed catastrophically, but if he could return and report what he had witnessed, perhaps that failure might yield some advantage, some understanding that could prevent future disasters. The flight back to the carrier stretched across 2 hours of mounting anxiety as fuel gauges dropped toward empty and damaged aircraft struggled to maintain altitude and speed. Yamashita found himself leading a small group of 3 other Zeros, their original leaders dead or missing, navigating by compass heading and dead reckoning toward where the Japanese carriers should be. The ocean below showed no features by which to judge their position, just endless rolling swells that all looked identical. At 01120, one of the Zeros in Yamashita's group waggled its wings in the signal for fuel exhaustion, then gently descended toward the ocean. The pilot executed a controlled ditching, keeping his aircraft's nose up to minimize impact, and the Zero skipped once across the water before settling. Yamashita circled once, noting the pilot climbing from his cockpit onto the wing, but there was nothing he could do to help. They were still hundreds of miles from friendly forces, and the ocean would claim another life with the same indifference it had shown to thousands before. The Zuikaku appeared on the horizon at 01145 like a vision from a more innocent time, her flight deck busy with recovery operations for other returning aircraft. Yamashita's fuel gauge showed empty, the engine running on fumes and vapor. As he entered the landing pattern and configured his Zero for approach, the landing signal officer's paddles guided him through a textbook approach, and his aircraft thumped onto the deck with solid precision, catching the arresting wire and jerking to a halt that felt like salvation after the morning's trauma. Climbing from his cockpit, Yamashita felt his legs shake with released tension and exhaustion. Deck crew rushed forward to manhandle his Zero out of the landing area, clearing space for the next returning aircraft, and he stumbled toward the island superstructure on legs that seemed disconnected from his will. Around him, other pilots were arriving, their faces showing the same shock and confusion that he felt, and he realized that his experience had not been unique. The entire strike force had encountered something unprecedented, something that had shattered their understanding of aerial combat. The debriefing began 30 minutes after the last surviving aircraft recovered, with Air Group Commander Nakajima presiding over a room full of exhausted, traumatized pilots. 21 aircraft had failed to return from the 64 that had launched that morning, a loss rate of approximately 33%, and many of the survivors showed battle damage that would require extensive repair. More critically, the strike force had failed to inflict any damage on the American carriers, had not even reached attack range before they're being turned back by the defensive fighters. Commander Nakajima's face showed the strain of command as he asked for pilot reports, seeking to understand what had gone so catastrophically wrong. One after another, the survivors described coordinated American fighter attacks, described Hellcats appearing wherever the Japanese formation turned, described defensive tactics that seemed to anticipate every Japanese move. The cumulative picture that emerged was of an enemy who possessed some form of supernatural awareness, who could see what was happening across dozens of miles of sky and direct fighters with precision impossible through traditional methods. When Yamashita's turn came to report, he chose his words carefully, conscious that what he was about to say might sound like excuse-making or cowardice. "Commander, I observed at least 30 American fighters during the engagement, possibly as many as 50, but more significant than the numbers was their coordination. They operated as a unified force, responding to some form of centralized direction. Multiple times, I witnessed Hellcats breaking off advantageous combats to reposition elsewhere, behavior inconsistent with individual pilot initiative. They appeared to know where we were at all times, and they positioned to counter our movements before we executed them." Several other pilots nodded in agreement, adding their own observations that supported Yamashita's assessment. Lieutenant Nakano, who had led a division of dive bombers, described watching American fighters intercept his approach vector as if they had been waiting there for us, as if they knew our route before we flew it. Another Zero pilot recounted seeing what appeared to be command aircraft circling at high altitude, though they had not engaged directly in combat, suggesting some form of airborne control capability. Commander Nakajima listened to all the reports in silence, his expression growing increasingly troubled. Finally he spoke. "Gentlemen, I will be honest with you. What you describe is outside my experience and understanding. The Americans appear to have developed a tactical system that gives them decisive advantage in defensive operations. Until we understand this system and develop counters to it, I fear that further strike missions will meet similar fates. The admission hung in the air like smoke from burning aircraft. For a Japanese commander to acknowledge that the enemy possessed advantages that could not be overcome through fighting spirit represented a profound break with military doctrine and cultural expectations. Yet the morning's disaster spoke for itself, written in the empty spaces where 21 pilots should have been sitting, written in the failure to accomplish even the basic objective of attacking enemy carriers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Historical analysis conducted in subsequent decades, drawing on both Japanese and American records, would reveal what Yamashita and his fellow pilots had encountered that October morning. The Americans had deployed what they called centralized fighter direction, a system that integrated radar detection with radio-controlled coordination of defensive fighters. A single officer, sitting in the Combat Information Center aboard a carrier, could see the entire battle through radar returns and direct dozens of fighters through radio commands, creating coordination impossible through visual observation alone. The system represented a revolution in aerial warfare comparable to the introduction of radar itself. Traditional fighter defense had relied on standing patrols and visual detection, with individual pilots or small formations operating independently once combat was joined. This approach consumed enormous amounts of fuel and time, with fighters often failing to intercept incoming strikes simply because they were looking in the wrong place when the enemy arrived. Centralized fighter direction solved these problems through technology and systematic command. Radar provided detection at ranges exceeding 100 miles, giving defenders time to position fighters optimally. Radio control allowed precise vectoring of fighters to intercept points, ensuring that defensive resources were concentrated where needed rather than scattered randomly. And centralized command enabled a single officer with a comprehensive view of the battle to make decisions about priority targets and resource allocation that individual pilots could never achieve from inside their cockpits. Lieutenant Commander Edgar, directing the defense that morning from inside the Lexington's CIC, had managed approximately 50 Hellcats through the engagement, positioning them in layers that forced the Japanese to fight through multiple defensive lines. His radar had tracked the incoming strike force continuously from initial detection, allowing him to calculate intercept vectors and assign fighters to specific threats based on their type and position. The system was not perfect, requiring constant adjustments as aircraft moved and circumstances changed, but it provided enormous advantages over the Japanese approach of coordinated group tactics executed through visual signals and radio calls between individual flight leaders. For Yamashita, sitting in the debriefing room aboard Zuikaku, and gradually understanding that he had faced something fundamentally new, the implications seemed overwhelming. If the Americans could consistently achieve the coordination he had witnessed, if they could direct their fighters with such precision that Japanese strike forces could not penetrate defenses, then the entire strategic calculus of carrier warfare had shifted. Numbers alone would not overcome such systematic advantages, nor would fighting spirit or individual pilot skill. The evening of October the 24th found Yamashita sitting alone in the junior officers' mess, staring at a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. Around him, other pilots spoke in quiet tones about the morning's battle, but he found himself unable to join their conversations. His mind kept returning to the moment when he had first understood that they were facing unprecedented coordination, the moment when tactical disadvantage had crystallized into strategic reality. Lieutenant Nakano approached and sat down across from Yamashita without waiting for invitation. "You lost your division leader this morning," the dive bomber pilot said quietly. "Lieutenant Commander Saito was a good officer. His loss diminishes us all." Yamashita nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he tried to speak. After a moment, Nakano continued, "What he told you before he died, about reporting what you observed, that was wise counsel. Someone at Fleet Headquarters must understand what we face today." "Will they believe it?" Yamashita finally found words, though they came out briefer than intended. Will they accept that the Americans have developed tactical capabilities that make our current doctrine obsolete, or will they dismiss it as excuse-making by pilots who failed in their mission? The question hung between them, unanswerable, because both men understood the culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Admitting that the enemy possessed advantages that could not be overcome through superior spirit risked accusations of defeatism, even cowardice. Yet, the alternative, continuing to launch strike forces into defensive systems they could not penetrate, promised only more deaths without corresponding gains. Nakano seemed to read Yamashita's thoughts. "Perhaps both things are true," he said slowly. "Perhaps headquarters will not believe, and perhaps more pilots will die before reality forces acceptance of what we learned today. But that does not release us from the responsibility to report accurately what we witnessed. History will judge whether our leaders had wisdom to listen." The words carried weight beyond their immediate meaning, hinting at doubts about Japanese strategy and leadership that had been unthinkable in the war's early years. Yamashita recognized in Nakano's tone the same disillusionment that he felt growing in his own heart, the slow realization that courage and skill might not be sufficient against an enemy who had industrialized warfare and developed systematic advantages that individual heroism could not overcome. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, as historians would later name the multi-day engagement of which Yamashita's mission formed one small part, represented the death knell of Japanese carrier aviation. The Imperial Navy committed its remaining strength to stopping the American invasion of the Philippines, and over 4 days of savage combat lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. More critically, Japanese naval aviation lost hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and aircraft, suffering casualties that the Empire's depleted training programs and dwindling industrial capacity could never replace. Yamashita survived the battle and continued flying through the war's final months. But the character of operations changed fundamentally after Leyte Gulf. With conventional strike tactics proving ineffective against American defensive systems, Japanese commanders increasingly turned to kamikaze attacks, suicide missions where pilots deliberately crashed explosive-laden aircraft into enemy ships. The logic was brutal but inescapable. If Japanese pilots could not penetrate American defenses through conventional means, then perhaps removing the requirement to survive and return would allow them to achieve at least some measure of success. Yamashita received orders for kamikaze training in early December 1944, reporting to a special attack unit based at Clark Field in the Philippines. The training was brief, focused on the mechanics of identifying targets and maintaining controlled flight into impact rather than the extensive aerial combat instruction that had characterized his earlier education. He found the philosophical indoctrination more troubling than the technical preparation, the constant emphasis on death as the highest form of service, on sacrifice as the ultimate expression of loyalty to emperor and nation. Yet, even as instructors preached the nobility of self-destruction, Yamashita could not escape the arithmetic of futility. If 50 American fighters, coordinated by radar, could defeat 60 Japanese aircraft flown by experienced pilots, attempting to survive and return, what chance did individual suicide attackers have against the same defensive system? The Americans would simply vector their Hellcats to intercept kamikazes before they reached their targets, shooting them down with the same efficiency they had demonstrated in conventional combat. Historical records compiled from both American and Japanese sources, including detailed analyses in works such as Richard Frank's comprehensive examination of the Pacific War's final year and Thomas Cutler's study of naval aviation tactics, reveal that Yamashita's skepticism proved well-founded. While kamikaze attacks did achieve some successes, particularly during the Okinawa campaign, when American ships operated close to Japanese bases and faced overwhelming numbers of attackers, the overall effectiveness of suicide tactics remained limited. American radar-controlled fighter direction, improved anti-aircraft weapons, and sophisticated damage control procedures meant that most kamikazes were destroyed before reaching their targets, and many of those that did hit ships caused less damage than their pilots' deaths warranted. The war's final months brought a grinding decline in Japanese capabilities that even the most optimistic officers could not deny. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft that might otherwise have flown. Ammunition stocks dwindled to levels that precluded realistic training. Food rations dropped to near starvation levels for both military personnel and civilians. And, through it all, American forces advanced with methodical inevitability, capturing island after island, tightening the blockade that strangled Japan's ability to wage war. Yamashita flew his last combat mission on March 3, 1945, escorting kamikaze aircraft toward American vessels off Okinawa. His orders specified that he was to ensure the suicide attackers reached their targets, but was to return himself, as experienced pilots remained valuable for training purposes and defensive operations. The moral contradiction in these instructions, ordering him to help others die while preserving his own life, created a cognitive dissonance that he struggled to reconcile with concepts of honor and duty. The mission encountered the now familiar wall of American fighters, Hellcats, guided with precision to intercept positions by radar operators who saw the Japanese formation while it was still dozens of miles distant. Yamashita watched two of the kamikazes he was escorting fall in flames before they came within sight of American ships, their pilots' sacrifices negated by defensive systems against which courage alone provided no answer. He himself survived only by using every bit of his accumulated combat experience, jinking and weaving through a sky full of tracers, nursing his damaged Zero back to base on a sputtering engine and prayers. The debriefing afterward was perfunctory, the reporting officer barely interested in Yamashita's account of the engagement. What was there to say that had not been said 1,000 times before? American defenses remained impenetrable except at enormous cost, and Japan's capacity to sustain such costs had been exhausted months ago. The war continued not because victory remained possible, but because surrender remained culturally and politically unacceptable to leadership that had invested too much pride in the conflict to acknowledge defeat. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber dropped a single atomic bomb on Hiroshima, obliterating the city and killing tens of thousands instantly. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. Between these two acts of unprecedented destruction, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with overwhelming force. The combination of nuclear weapons, Soviet entry, and the prospect of continued conventional bombing and eventual invasion made further resistance militarily meaningless. Emperor Hirohito's announcement of surrender on August 15th reached Yamashita at an airfield in southern Kyushu, where he had been preparing for defensive operations against the expected American invasion. The emperor's voice, formal and archaic in its court language, barely comprehensible to common soldiers, nevertheless conveyed unmistakable meaning. The war was over. Japan had been defeated. The Imperial Armed Forces would lay down their weapons and accept occupation by the enemy they had fought so desperately to resist. Yamashita stood at attention as the broadcast concluded, his face betraying no emotion, though his mind reeled with conflicting feelings: relief that he would not die in futile combat, shame that his nation had been defeated, grief for the countless friends and comrades who had perished during 4 years of brutal warfare. And underneath all these emotions, a quiet acknowledgement that the outcome had been inevitable since long before he had encountered those 50 coordinated Hellcats over the Philippine Sea in October 1944. The American occupation of Japan brought Yamashita face to face with aspects of the enemy he had fought but never truly known. As Allied forces implemented demilitarization and democratic reforms, as war crimes trials prosecuted Japanese leaders for their actions during the conflict, Yamashita found himself working as a translator for occupation authorities. His technical knowledge of aviation and his competent English, learned during pre-war naval training, made him valuable for interviews with captured Japanese aviation personnel and for translating technical documents that the Americans needed to understand Japanese capabilities. It was in this capacity that Yamashita finally learned the details of what he had encountered that October morning. An American naval intelligence officer interviewing him about Japanese carrier operations casually mentioned centralized fighter direction and radar-controlled interception as if these were commonly known concepts. When Yamashita expressed fascination and asked for clarification, the officer arranged for him to visit a decommissioned combat information center where radar sets and plotting boards sat silent but intact. Standing in that darkened room, looking at the glowing radar screen that showed nothing now but was still operational, Yamashita finally understood what he had faced. The green circular display with its sweeping line that painted targets as bright returns, the radio sets through which a single officer could speak to dozens of pilots simultaneously, the plotting boards where positions were marked and vectors calculated. This was the invisible enemy that had defeated his strike force, the systematic advantage that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. A single man controlled all those fighters, Yamashita asked the American officer, who was showing him the equipment, speaking slowly in English to ensure understanding. One person directed perhaps 50 aircraft through this machine and radio? The officer nodded, seeming pleased that Yamashita grasped the concept so quickly. Fighter direction officer, we call him. He sees the whole battle on radar, calculates intercept courses, gives vectors to pilots, makes defense much more efficient than having fighters search randomly. We developed the system in 43, perfected it by mid-44. Your strike forces never had a chance once we deployed it fully. The casual admission, delivered without malice or boasting, struck Yamashita harder than any weapon he had faced during the war. Never had a chance, all the courage, all the sacrifice, all the deaths of skilled pilots who had trained for years, negated by a technological system that they had not even known existed. The Americans had been fighting a different kind of war, one where information, superiority, and coordinated systems trumped individual heroism, and Japanese leadership had either not understood this reality or had been unable to acknowledge it. Yamashita's post-war life stretched across decades of rebuilding and reflection. He married in 1948, raised 3 children, and worked as a commercial aviation instructor, teaching the next generation of Japanese pilots to fly in a world where aviation served peaceful purposes rather than military conquest. He rarely spoke of his wartime experiences, finding that most people preferred to forget the difficult years and focus on Japan's remarkable economic recovery and democratic transformation. Yet, occasionally, when interviewing prospective students or lecturing at aviation schools, Yamashita would share the story of October 24th, 1944, not as a tale of glory or heroism, but as a lesson in how warfare evolves and how technical innovation can render traditional approaches obsolete overnight. We were brave, he would tell his students. We were skilled, but we were fighting yesterday's war with yesterday's tactics against an enemy who had moved into tomorrow. That is a disadvantage that no amount of courage can overcome. The broader implications of centralized fighter direction extended far beyond that single battle or even the Pacific War itself. The system pioneered by officers like Lieutenant Commander Edgar became the foundation for modern integrated air defense, evolving through the Cold War into increasingly sophisticated networks that linked radar sites, fighter bases, and command centers across entire continents. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, the Soviet PVO Streny system, and contemporary air defense networks all trace their conceptual lineage back to those combat information centers aboard World War II carriers. Military scholars studying the evolution of warfare consistently identify radar-controlled fighter direction as a pivotal innovation, ranking it alongside aircraft carriers themselves, radar and long-range bombers as technologies that fundamentally altered how nations fought. According to analyses published by institutions, including the Naval War College and the Royal United Services Institute, the integration of detection, communication, and command represented a shift from combat as individual contests of skill to combat as systematic coordination of resources, a shift that continues to define modern military operations. For the Japanese pilots who encountered this system without understanding what they faced, the experience proved profoundly disorienting. Tactical doctrines developed through years of training and combat experience suddenly proved inadequate. Individual skill, emphasized so heavily in Japanese military culture, could not compensate for systematic disadvantages in awareness and coordination. The psychological impact of facing an opponent who seemed to anticipate every move, who positioned defenders with uncanny precision, contributed to the declining morale and increasing desperation that characterized Japanese military operations in the war's final year. Historical documentation, preserved in archives, including the National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo, reveals that Japanese naval aviation never developed effective counters to American fighter direction. Some officers proposed flying at extremely low altitude to avoid radar detection, but this approach sacrificed the altitude advantage necessary for effective attack and greatly increased vulnerability to anti-aircraft fire. Others suggested overwhelming American defenses through sheer numbers, but Japan's declining industrial capacity and pilot training programs could not generate the necessary force levels. A few far-sighted officers recognized that only by developing comparable radar and coordination systems could Japan hope to match American capabilities. But by the time these proposals reached implementation stages, the war was already lost. Yamashita lived to see the digital age transform aviation beyond anything he could have imagined during his combat years. Modern fighter aircraft with radar systems that could track hundreds of targets simultaneously, with data links that shared information between aircraft instantaneously, with weapons that could engage enemies from beyond visual range, represented evolutionary descendants of the technological revolution he had encountered over the Philippine Sea. The principle remained constant even as specific technologies advanced. Information, superiority, and coordinated action multiplied combat effectiveness in ways that raw courage or individual skill could not match. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, Yamashita was invited to participate in a joint American-Japanese symposium on Pacific War aviation. Elderly now, his pilot's physique softened by age, he found himself sitting across a conference table from several American naval aviators who had flown Hellcats during the war. The conversation, conducted through interpreters and marked by mutual respect, ranged across shared experiences and different perspectives on battles they had fought from opposite sides. One of the Americans, a former Hellcat pilot named Rushing, who had flown in several major engagements, asked Yamashita about his memories of October 24th, 1944. "We knew we had radar advantage," Rushing said, "but we didn't fully understand how it looked from your side. Did you realize what you were facing?" Yamashita considered the question carefully before responding. "In the moment, no. I knew only that American fighters appeared everywhere, that your coordination seemed impossibly perfect. Only after the war, when I saw your combat information center, did I understand the system that had defeated us. You were fighting with tomorrow's weapons, while we fought with today's tactics." The American pilot nodded slowly. "And yet, you nearly broke through several times. I remember being scared during that battle, even with all our advantages. Your pilots were skilled and determined." The acknowledgement, offered across 5 decades of separation from the actual combat, seemed to carry more weight than any medal or official commendation. These men had tested themselves against each other in the ultimate arena and had survived to recognize the humanity and skill in their former opponents. Yamashita passed away in 2003 at the age of 82, having lived long enough to see aviation technology advance from the piston-engine fighters of his youth to stealth aircraft and unmanned drones. His obituary in the Asahi Shimbun mentioned his military service briefly, noting that he had been a naval aviator during the Pacific War, but focused primarily on his post-war contributions to Japanese commercial aviation and pilot training. A small private ceremony, attended by family, former students, and a few surviving veterans marked his passage. Among his personal effects, his family found the journal he had kept sporadically throughout his life, including entries from his military service. One passage, dated November 2nd, 1944, just days after the battle that had shattered his understanding of aerial combat, captured his state of mind at that pivotal moment. Today I am 23 years old, and I've seen the future of warfare. It is not glorious. It is not about individual courage or skill. It is about machines that see in the dark, about voices that command from far away, about coordination that turns many pilots into instruments of a single will. I do not know if I will survive this war, but I know that the kind of warrior I was trained to be is already obsolete, replaced by something I barely comprehend. The journal entry, preserved by his family and later donated to Japan's National Showa Memorial Museum, serves as a primary source for historians studying the psychological impact of technological change on combat personnel. It captures the moment when traditional military virtues confronted systematic innovation, when individual excellence met coordinated efficiency and found itself wanting not in courage or determination, but in relevance to the type of warfare that modern technology enabled. The battle over the Philippine Sea on October the 24th, 1944, lives on in military curriculum and historical analysis as an example of how tactical innovation can decisively shift combat outcomes. Young officers studying at naval academies and Air Force training schools examine the engagement to understand principles of integrated defense, centralized command, and information superiority that remain relevant despite dramatic changes in specific technologies. The radar sets and radio systems that seemed so revolutionary in 1944 have been succeeded by satellites, data links, and artificial intelligence. But the fundamental insight remains: warfare in the modern age favors those who can see furthest, coordinate most effectively, and bring systematic advantages to bear against opponents who fight as individuals. For Lieutenant Takeo Yamashita, the encounter represented both a tactical defeat and a profound learning experience. In the moment, facing 50 coordinated Hellcats with no understanding of what made their coordination possible, he had experienced the terror of fighting an opponent who possessed advantages he could neither see nor comprehend. In subsequent years, as he learned the technical details and historical context, he came to appreciate the battle as a turning point, not just in his personal life, but in the evolution of warfare itself. He had witnessed the moment when information technology became as important as weapons technology, when the ability to coordinate multiple assets trumped the skill of individual operators. The lesson transcends its specific historical context. In every generation, military forces must grapple with the challenge of incorporating new technologies while maintaining the human virtues of courage, skill, and determination that have always characterized effective warriors. The balance shifts constantly as capabilities evolve, but the tension remains between individual excellence and systematic efficiency, between traditional methods and innovative approaches, between the warrior as an individual hero and the warrior as a component in a larger network. Yamashita's story concludes not with dramatic resolution, but with quiet understanding. He had fought bravely in a war his nation lost, had survived when many of his comrades perished, had witnessed technological transformation that rendered his hard-won skills partially obsolete, and had lived to see both his nation and his former enemies build peaceful prosperity from war's ruins. The 50 Hellcats he had faced over the Philippine Sea, coordinated by an officer he never met in a combat information center he could not see, had taught him that modern warfare demands more than courage and skill. It demands adaptation, demands understanding that tools and systems matter as much as spirit, demands recognition that yesterday's advantages can become tomorrow's vulnerabilities in the blink of an eye. That October morning, when he had counted impossible numbers of American fighters appearing with impossible coordination, when he had realized his mission was doomed before reaching its target, Yamashita had glimpsed the future of aerial combat. It was a future where human pilots remained essential but operated as parts of larger systems, where courage mattered But information mattered more, where the warrior's ancient virtues of honor and skill found expression through technological networks that would have seemed like sorcery to previous generations. He had faced that future unprepared and had survived to tell the tale, a tale of transformation and evolution, of defeat transforming into understanding, of one man's encounter with the moment when warfare itself changed forever. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.